about, or we can maybe ask Kathryn what some of her key thoughts that were resonating in her mind over the last few hours.
Yeah, just sorry, one more from me. The timing of all of this. I mean, there's obviously quite a lot to do here, and the speed at which things need to be changed is all the expectations of change in society, at least, are pretty huge at the moment. And I think it's going to be interesting to discuss whether we can get things in shape in the same sort of timescale as people are expecting.
Yeah, so the time aspect as well was something that very much,
and leadership of that.
Yeah, exactly. And Kathryn, any comments from yourself? And just to let everybody know, we're not in the proper session yet. This is all just preamble. So the that little movie that you get before the real movie, as it were. Remember all those times when you could go to a cinema? I know it feels like that was decades ago. But yeah, Kathryn, any other thoughts from this morning while we welcome some of our other fantastic guests onto the panel? So Kathryn.
Yeah, I think the whole discussion around governance was particularly interesting, and the notion of what I sort of tend to refer to as corporate governance and then external governance, and currently is governmental sort of in the codes, and the notion of sort of looking at project governance as opposed to corporate governance, and something that stays with the project through the various ownerships which inevitably happen. I mean, it's so rare that a project is discovered, developed and run by the same company. You know, those very much the minority. So I thought that was particularly interesting this morning. And then also I think that whole the realization and that discussion around qualified person or competent person and the skill set is something that's quite close sort of to my heart as well. And it's something, I don't know if Ian Thompson is joining us. Is he joining us on the panel this afternoon?
He will be, yeah.
Yes, good. So I know it's something Ian and I sort of talked at length about, sort of the need for professional accreditation for social performance. And it's because we're seen as the non-technical contributors, and it's sort of a bit it doesn't sit right somehow.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Kathryn. Tanya, I note that you still don't have your glass of wine yet, but maybe I can use this as an opportunity to come to you as one of our fantastic contributors this morning, of any thoughts that you had following this morning's session.
What occurred to me was that many of the presentations that we heard, particularly from Canada and from Australia, all highlighted a number of similar issues that we're all dealing with. In other words, how to make this applicable to large companies, small companies, those who are in full-scale mining, those who are only in prospecting, those companies that have a decent budget versus those companies that have zero budget, and how to bring it all in a way that people look forward to applying it. And that's something that everybody's dealing with, and I think it's good to have these discussions so that we can all come to a reasonable conclusion at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. And I can see that Ed is waving at me in that time-honored fashion of, yes, he'd like to chip in here. Ed, over to you.
Yeah, it was just, I think one thing we kind of forget when we're talking, we tended to focus on the reporting codes and the investor and finance. But as you'll see from the 6 logos behind me, PERK is a grouping of 6 professional associations, you know, and a lot of this is to do with just really providing guidance to the professional members of the organizations we're mostly involved with. And you know, that came up this morning, of where, you know, people said they want to make it simple for, say, an exploration geologist to realize, you know, what they should be doing or who they should go to get the necessary information. So I think, you know, we should appreciate there's a bit of, you know, I think a lot of professional geologists would be willing and ready to, you know, take action on these things, but may not always be sure how to proceed with it. And I think sort of the you know, idea of having best practice guidelines as well as the reporting standards and codes, which I believe Canadian friends are going to talk a bit about is also useful. And well, SAM ESG are also guidelines for best practice.
Does that mean we have to make everything simple for exploration geologists?
For all geologists.
I'm seeing slippery slope appear in front of us there, but thank you, Master Dixon, for introducing that into the mix and picking up on what Ed was saying there. Just for everybody who is dialing in at the moment, don't worry, you're not late. It's just that our fantastic panelists are having a little bit of pre-banter, as we might call it here in the UK. So we're just discussing some of the aspects that came through in the roundtables that we ran earlier on today. For anybody who missed them, you can catch up with them straight away. So go to www.responsiblerawmaterials.com and go to the webpage, and then you'll be able to see the link to the YouTube channel. And on the YouTube channel, you will find the recording from this morning. Now, with regards to that recording, we have a team beavering away in the background, putting together a highlight reel, which I'm very excited about. So we do actually have a team of people that are recording certain sound bites as well from the conversation that we had this morning, and then of course the conversation that we're about to have just now. So we've got 5 minutes until we get started properly. So that means if you don't have that glass of water, cup of tea, coffee, or whatever else you might like, feel free to go and grab that now. And panelists, that includes you, so feel free to go and get anything you need, because we will be going live properly in 5 minutes time. For those of you who have managed to avoid the Zoom webinar platform over the last 12 months, congratulations, but welcome to this wonderful world of virtual meetings. If you are an attendee, don't feel disappointed that we can't hear you or see you. That is unfortunately intentional. It's not because we don't love you. It's just because we're trying to corral this motley crew who are already on the panel here today. You can communicate with us, however, by using some of the buttons that you will see down at the bottom of your screen. So you have the chat box, so feel free to click on that, and then over on the right hand side of your screen you'll see that some people are already chattering away within there. So feel free to pass comment, ask questions within the chat, or you can use the Q&A button. So if you open that up, you'll see a totally separate box magically appears on your screen, and you can pose questions to any of our panelists through that. Now, this morning was incredibly busy, and there was lots of fantastic chat and questions, some of which we managed to answer or address during the session, some of which we didn't have time to get to. If we don't manage to get to your question, etc., don't worry, and we will be posting all of the questions and relevant answers to them online at some point in time over the next few days. So please don't feel disappointed if your question apparently gets ignored. We are coming to it, we promise. So we've got another 3 minutes left. I'm just going to pass quickly. Actually, I tell you what, we're going to do a couple more microphone checks. So Gloria, are you there? Would you like to just check your microphone and your video? If we're not there, we'll come to you in the background. I might gently pass across to the fantastic John to just provide some more thoughts from this morning, just while we get our final few panelists settled. So John, back to yourself.
Yeah, I think just one idea to put out there, which I don't know if we'll be able to cover it today, but one thing we haven't really discussed is climate change as a modifying factor, and whether or not there's any appetite to include that in this discussion as well. I think a lot of the changes that we're trying to adjust to are all to do with meeting, for example, the Green Deal in Europe, where that is entirely about climate change and producing the materials required to support that. So I think it's something that needs to be considered, I think, in terms of certainly when you in mine planning, for example, how do you design a carbon neutral mine, for example? Could guidelines for that be included in the the reporting codes as well, if they're not already.
Is that for us to discuss there, John? Throwing that one over
maybe,
the fence.
yeah. I'll just let that drops there. So yeah, but it's yeah, I think it's easy to. I think climate needs to come as part of the E these days. Probably it isn't quite so much at the moment, but certainly I think some of the codes have got a section now for considering alternative technologies or climate smart technologies.
Yeah, brilliant.
So it'd be
Fantastic.
good to standardize that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. So what we're going to do here is, I know we've got one or two final people to check on microphones, but I think we might just take a deep breath and do that on the fly. I'm looking at Rose to see if this is a good idea or not. She's smiling at me, and that look tells me, Sarah, it's on your head if you decide to do that. Okay, I will be accountable. I think we'll just go with it. So in the last few seconds before we get going properly, just to make everybody aware, so this session is already being recorded. It is also streaming live to YouTube. We welcome all comments, questions, ideas, be it on the chat or in the Q&A via Zoom, or also through the comments section within YouTube. Please do feel free to engage with us there. The recording is live immediately. So if you want to go back and listen to anything again, or perhaps if you want to play this as the Tuesday evening movie for your family, I don't know. I'm just supposing that maybe some of the online streaming platforms may have run out of content by now, then do feel free to do so. Also, there'll be lots of work going on behind the scenes with Perk, in fact, and Responsible Raw Materials. So the three organisations who have collaborated together to bring this here for you today. So with that, it is now 4:30 GMT. I'm looking at John, my partner in crime with regards to co-hosting. We're all good to go.
Yeah,
excellent.
All set.
Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second of two roundtables on environmental, social and governance, or ESG, within mineral resources and reserves, codes and standards. This morning, we had a fantastic session where we spoke to many, many different people from around the world, and the lineup was truly spectacular. And a massive thank you to everybody who took part in this morning's session. Everybody who's online now, you've got quite a high bar to beat, just in terms of your colleagues who spoke this morning. So with regards to all of that, who did we hear from? We started off by looking at Europe, and we're going to go back to Europe again to start with today. And Kathryn Mccallum gave a fantastic overview with regards to some of the key aspects of the InFact project, which is a European funded project, and we'll hear more from Kathryn in a second. And then we passed sideways to the fantastic Ed Sides, who represented PERC, so the European standard with regards to mineral resources and reserves. We then decided to fly across the Atlantic, and we went to some of our fabulous Canadian friends who had stayed up late just to be with us. And we got some fantastic insight into what has been going on with regards to their code, so 43101. Then we went to Australia just because we could, and we heard from members of both JORC and AusIMM with regards to what is going on there, and some fabulous updates and developments happening there. They were gracious enough to share with us a number of links and also invitation to contribute to what they're doing, all the details of which will appear on the website. We then headed in a northerly direction, and we went to Indonesia and heard what they are up to there, especially with regards to ensuring that everything is applicable both to listed companies and unlisted companies. So public and private organizations, it doesn't matter who you are, this should be supportive of everybody. And then we hopped up to China, where again loads of work has been done. They invited all of us, at least I think it was an open invitation, to a summit on this at some point in time in 2021. And also they've begun to provide a lot of guidance with regards to ESG and resources and reserves, aimed at both domestic operations in China and also international operations as well, which was fabulous to see. Then we went to the wilds of Mongolia, and Girli, who was dialing in from being on site in the Gobi Desert, gave us fabulous insights to what's been going on within Mongolia. And she was absolutely brilliant to hear from, because she is the lady who has held the pen, or holds the pen, I should say, with regards to ESG and resources and reserves in Mongolia. And then we decided to warm up a little bit, and we headed off south to South Africa. And we finished off this morning's session with Teresa and Tanya, who gave us brilliant insight into what South Africa has been up to. And in fact, where South Africa has been leading the way in this, because they have had ESG guidance with regards to this area for a number of years now. And so, of course, can share with us areas that everybody else can learn from. John, have I missed anyone? Because that would be really embarrassing.
No, confirm that you haven't. No, that was great. It was a really good tour around the world. Actually, it was yeah, quite exciting.
Yeah, so it was absolutely great. And the way that we ran the discussion this morning was very much as a discussion, or as a bit of an interview, as we worked our way around the world. For those of you who weren't here, just to let you know that there's a huge amount of information that is in support of today's session on the website, and just so that you can see it, because of course we can all multitask now, especially when we're dialing into these sessions. So if you go to the website, which, as I mentioned, is just www.responsiblerawmaterials.com, which we're hosting on behalf of InFact, Perk and ourselves for this event, what you will see here is, of course, a link to the YouTube channel, but also you will see a link to the agenda, which you can download, so you can see exactly what we're expecting to happen today. And then, most importantly, you'll see that there is some pre-reading from each of the different codes or standards. And what you can do there is, if you click on that, you will see that each of our representatives have been absolutely brilliant in providing us with some background information as to what has been happening in those codes and standards. So this is all there for you to digest in your own time. And then, of course, off the bottom of here, there's some more background information for you to absorb at your leisure. John, is there anything else we want to say from a logistics perspective before we get cracking properly?
Just to say that the Q&A and the chat is open in the on Zoom here. And that was really useful this morning in terms of getting some of the viewpoints of the attendees. So please do use them. We've got our eyes on it, and we can take the opportunity to pass some of those questions and comments on to the panelists here. Brilliant.
Thank you very much for that, John. So with regards to what we're going to be doing over the next 2 hours, so this session of course started at 4:30. We will finish at 6:30 GMT, whatever that will be with you. We're going to start off by passing what we're going to do a little bit of a recap of any salient points that came through from this morning. I know, John, we've already done that in the preamble, but if there's anything else that you would like to bring to the fore, please do so. And then we will pass straight to the lovely Kathryn, who is going to give us a bit of insight as to what the European funded project called InFact got up to with regards to sustainable mining, and how some of that could maybe feed into ESG within mineral resources and reserves. But John, any comments or reflections on this morning's session before we get going properly?
Yeah, I think there was a hell of a lot of to take away from it, actually, and I think it was really interesting to hear how places around the world are approaching this in various different ways and had various different thoughts as to how best to go about it. But overall, I think it was great to see that there was such a willingness to come together and collaborate, because I think this is something that needs a consistent approach. And yeah, there's great willingness from all of these organizations to work together on this and take what the various bits are that each different code has been doing and bring it together into something that works for everybody. So hopefully we can really build on that during this session.
Yeah, definitely. So with that, I'm now going to invite the lovely Kathryn Mccallum to share her screen. She is the only person who's been allowed a PowerPoint slide deck, by the way, everybody. That's just how special Kathryn is. So Kathryn is going to share her screen now and use that to help her provide a very succinct summary, because Kathryn, I know that you could share so much with us with regards to this on the InFact project and some of the outputs from it. Kathryn, over to yourself. And I'm going to say those immortal words about a certain mute button.
There we go.
There we go. Awesome.
It's been a long day. I was just saying, every time you say GMT, I keep thinking GMT. But I think that's probably because of the time of day and the length of today. Yeah, anyway, thank you for this, and thanks. You know, it's great to see so many people actually sort of attending sort of this session. In fact, the clue's in the name, really. It stands for innovative, non-invasive and fully acceptable exploration technologies. Over 3 years, a group of sort of partners from around Europe have been focusing on the technology. We've been looking at sort of drones, helicopters, all sorts of sort of innovative sort of geophysical techniques. But alongside that, in parallel, been focusing on the acceptability and what defines acceptability and what needs to be done for exploration to be acceptable within a European context. The project's focused Europe-wide, but it has sort of gone into sort of rabbit holes, really, or focused in on sort of three sort of reference areas: one in Finland, one in Germany, and one in Spain. So while we've been looking at acceptability sort of across the continent, we've also been sort of focusing deep down on sort of what is required within these three areas, and they're very different. One is sort of a post-mining area, one is a current mining area, and one is an exploration area within a Natura 2000 site, which makes it quite special and sort of requires lots and lots of considerations sort of from an environmental and a social perspective. In terms of acceptability, the barriers and challenges that we've found over the 3 years have been sort of fivefold. Existing land use comes up again and again and again, whether that be land use that's for recreation purposes or for agriculture or other industry. The negative perceptions of exploration and mining, those have just grown throughout the project, with the last year of the project actually, not our project, but other EU projects sort of doing sort of similar sort of research, having sort of open letters written about them to the European Commission, complaining about sort of social aspects and the lack of engagement, and complaining about exploration and mining in Europe. And this is quite pertinent and important, really, because for the first time in Europe, you've had networks of dissenters against mining, from sort of projects in Northern Ireland through to Finland, through to Romania, sort of working together and collaborating together to cohesively to complain against mining. The cost of mineral exploration, this is also an important issue. Most of the mining in Europe is not publicly listed. It tends to be sort of private sort of funding, and that funding is hard to come by. And so the role of the resources and reporting codes within that is something which is I think is very relevant to the discussion today. Environmental concerns continue, that they always have been, and I think they always will be there. But European legislation is incredibly robust in terms of environmental concerns. And then governance processes. You have the EU legislation, but then you have subsidiarity and you have the national sort of legislation. And for the most of Europe, and in particular the most of the EU states, they are members of the OECD, which means that what is known sort of in sort of other parts of the world as good international industry practice doesn't necessarily apply, and national planning law is what determines the sort of the regulatory process or the planning process or the permissions sort of for mining in a European context. And so then people sort of get caught up then between what's required locally and then within the EU, and it is seen as incredibly complex and a bit of a minefield for projects sort of to navigate. So looking at sort of all of these sort of barriers, sort of from the social aspects of the project, so we've sort of focused in and sort of we've pulled together sort of a vision for what is required for mining to be acceptable within a European context. And within this vision, we focused on three sort of overarching areas: the governance and the regulation, which I've alluded to already, society and community, which I'm not going to talk about today because that would take the whole of the 2 hours, but then the finance and the industry. And where the reporting codes sit is sort of really within that finance and industry sort of sector, sort of what is done, what is their role actually in sort of, I suppose, opening sort of gateways to finance. How we plan to do this, we've pulled together a roadmap. It's a 3-year roadmap, and it's sort of been submitted to the EU this afternoon in between these two sort of round tables. And it's sort of, it's cohesive, but again, it focuses on the governance and regulatory aspects, the community and society aspects, and the finance and industry aspects. And sort of the reporting codes, in particular PERC, the Pan-European sort of reporting code, is sort of features within that roadmap. So looking really at a project development sequence, this is something that'll be familiar to all of you here. And so I'm not going to sort of dwell on this too much, but this is sort of the standard process, I think, in most jurisdictions, in terms of where sort of mineral resources reporting and reserves reporting sort of fits sort of within the scheme. But looking at how decisions are made, one of the things we did, and in fact, we took a step back and we actually looked sort of at the standard route and looked at where decisions, especially decisions in relation to environmental, social and governance factors or modifying factors or considerations sort of should be. And really from an exploration or from a mine life sort of cycle perspective, we really advocate that ESG considerations should be right at the beginning of the process. So pulling this quickly then back to the reserves, there are 14 codes out there at the moment. And I think over the course of today, we'll have spoken with, I think, at least 12 of them through the roundtables, which is amazing. Some of them have been updated quite recently. Some of them have not been updated for quite a long time, but are in that process now of exploring what to do and where and how to do it. So we're really excited from a European perspective to sort of, I've personally been involved sort of in the PERC sort of review and update, which is ongoing at the moment, and that's been fantastic. But we're excited sort of to hear from all of the other codes to see what you're doing, how you're doing it, what you can share in terms of incorporating ESG and extending them through the modifying factors from the beginning of exploration through to the end. So I look forward to hearing from you all now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Kathryn. That's absolutely fantastic. And all of us are giving you a round of applause from our sides of our muted microphones. So embrace that applause now. So the reason why Kathryn has teed us up so beautifully with regards to this is because the reason that we're here today is based on a conversation that was had between Kathryn and myself, and primarily because we were both supporting PERC with regards to the incorporation of ESG factors within the update that Ed is going to tell us a little bit about just now. So that is why this event is brought to you today by InFact, and of course you've seen a little bit with regards to that from Kathryn, and obviously John has been working on that as well. PERC, who are about to hear a lot about from the fantastic Ed, and then Responsible Raw Materials, which is of course the website that we keep pointing you to, all of which are all volunteer organisations, and so we're doing this with the passion and the excitement that comes with the territory. So with that, I'm going to now pass over to John to give us a quick introduction to Perk. Now, this introduction is based on the information that you can find on the website, and then we will go straight into the fabulous Ed, who can tell us some more information. So John, over to yourself.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Kathryn, as well for the presentation there. It's been a real privilege and fascinating to work on, in fact, over these last 3 years. And as an aside, if we can make something work for Europe, which is inherently a pretty complicated part of the world, then we're hopeful that it could be applied elsewhere. So, which is where Perk comes in. I mean, Perk is our local reporting standard, pan-European reporting codes, and it was last updated in 2017. And as of last year, after the last Crisco AGM in September last year, Perk has been working on incorporating additional guidance for ESG reporting in the Perk code. And I believe Ed's been making excellent progress with that to the extent that it might be ready for review by March or April this year. So we're all really excited to hear more about what Ed's been up to, and seeing if we can use the new Perk code as a prototype, if you like, for taking things forward even further. As just quick direction to the Perk website at perkstandard.org. There's quite a few papers and presentations that can be downloaded from there if you want some additional reading on that. So with no further ado, over to Ed. Thanks, Ed.
So just while Ed is taking off his microphone, so Ed this morning gave us a fabulous introduction to all things Perk, Crisco, and other random letters that are put together in something that means something. So I just wonder, before we go diving into the world of the pan-European resource reserve standards, maybe Ed, would you be able to do the same and just remind us as to how the different codes and standards fit together, and what is this thing called Crisco that if you are not part of this community on a regular basis, you'll be wondering what on earth we're talking about. Over to you, Ed.
Yeah, I was planning to do that anyway, because I'm conscious that there may be quite a few people listening in who have no idea what Crisco and reporting standards and stuff are, whereas there's a lot of us on the panel who it's sort of been second nature to us for quite a time. I did post in the chat the link to the Crisco website, and I'm sure that'll be available somewhere afterwards. But Crisco stands, well, it's an acronym that comes from an older name, but the current name of the committee is the Committee for Mineral Reserves International Reporting Standards, and it's the international umbrella group which now has 14 members from around the world, as you saw in that slide from Kathryn. And you know, one of the key things of this, I think, is that all of those codes and standards have agreed on definitions of, I think it's 12 standard terms. So terms like mineral resources, mineral reserves, and inferred resources, measured resources, and so forth. We have an international agreement on the use of those terms, and that sort of, if you like, is the common glue that binds all those groups together. But another element is what's referred to as the Crisco International Reporting Template, which you can find on the Crisco website. That was updated in 2019, and that's sort of like a template reporting code or standard which is used by new members that are wanting to join Crisco. They will sort of use that as the basis for developing their own codes and standards. And likewise, when codes such as Perk are updating, which is what we're going to be talking about in a minute, we will refer to the latest updates. So if you like, the Perk, the Crisco International Reporting Template is a consensus from all the international groups of what's important, and it's evolves in that it's been updated. I think the first version of the Crisco template was 2006, and then it's been updated in 2013, and most recently in 2019. And then I'll maybe move on now to Perk, which is the European member of Crisco, and we have what's referred to as the Perk reporting standard. It was originally originated as something called the IMM reporting code back in 1991, but came into be termed the PERK reporting standard in 2009, and that's been updated in 2013 and 2017, and we're currently working on the latest one. And I should just mention too, you'll see behind me on the screen 6 logos, which are the 6 professional organizations that are form the PERK committee, and PERK being the Pan-European Reserves and Resources Reporting Committee. Now, just to lead on to the ESG and why we're all here today, when I was looking back in my notes preparing for this, I realized one of my first contacts with Kathryn Mccallum had been in 2017, just after we released the last version of the PERK standard, when she emailed the committee asking, I've seen your new standard, do you have any thoughts on incorporating guidance on social license? And that was all added to the list of things we needed to look at in the next update. But then, obviously there's been a lot of pressure from investors and financial institutions on companies about corporate social responsibility and environmental social governance and so forth. So we're all I think all of the Crisco NROs have been aware of this sort of groundswell of feeling that we should be addressing that and providing more guidance to the people who are preparing reports. So at the Crisco AGM last year, PERK had already started the ball rolling, and Crisco sort of said, well, you kind of go ahead and lead in giving an example of how this can be done, and then any change anyway would be circulated with the other Crisco members as well. And we've had assistance from Kathryn Mccallum and Sarah, yourself, who again have because they have networked with a lot of the people who have been involved in our discussions this morning, this afternoon, and the idea came up it'd be useful to discuss this and just find out, so that in our PERK reporting standard update we don't miss out on good ideas from other people, and we can also share a bit what we're doing as well. And in terms of timeline, we're sort of finalizing a draft now, and that will then hopefully we'll complete our internal checks next month, and then in March we would hope to be sharing that with the other Crisco members for comment, as well as with members of the PERK professional organizations.
Great, thanks, Ed. You've just answered all of my questions that I posed to you this morning. So I'm now going to go off piece with that and say that, so when we're talking about our mineral resources and reserves, I mean, are these constrained to your stereotypical base and bulk metals, or is it something which is broader than that? So what is the scope of this, and does PERK differ from any of the other standards and codes from around the world?
Okay, yeah, and go on that. I've just realized we haven't really explained to people what mineral resources and mineral reserves are, but so maybe I'll just do that before answering your question on commodities, because mineral resources essentially are what we think is there in the ground, but to actually start digging that out, we have to do a lot of other assessments to see, is it really economically viable and technically feasible to extract it. So as a geologist, I would be involved in defining what's there in the ground, which we would term a mineral resource. And then we apply what we tend to use as modifying factors. The modifying factors include mining, processing, metallurgical, economic, marketing, legal, environmental, infrastructure, social, and governmental factors. And I'm reading, looking on the side there to read from the figure so that I make sure but basically they're all the other elements that have to come into play when you're considering extracting something. But going back to your question about commodities, yeah, PERK is well, obviously within the extractive industry in Europe is different, and from say many of the other members like Australasia and Canada, where there's quite important mining industries, but it's much more significant industry. Whereas in Europe, historically, the time of the Industrial Revolution, there were very important mining industries. I live in South Wales, where there was lots of coal mining, and they're all now shut. But so things have moved on there. But what is of more interest in Europe are a lot of the industries dealing with industrial minerals, cement and aggregates, dimension stone and so forth. And in fact, guidance on those was introduced in PERC because of the interests of several of the companies within Europe, and we have, I think, the main companies that, or a lot of the companies that have adopted the PERC standard are actually industrial mineral or cement companies, and that would differ, say, from Australasia and Canada. And those changes initially introduced in the PERC standard have been incorporated. If you look at the 2019 Crisco template, you will see there's an appendix on I don't remember the title exactly, but there's an appendix on industrial minerals and there's an appendix on dimension stone, and they essentially have arisen from changes that initially came in the PERC standard and have, if you like, propagated upwards to the Crisco international reporting template. And then I guess where any of the Crisco members have similar concerns that they have important, industrial minerals. I would think Turkey might be one example. They'll probably adopt those or use them to incorporate their own changes.
So thank you for that, Ed. So now we understand, okay, what is a resource, a reserve? So we understand that difference. And then with regards to, I guess, the breadth of what PERC includes, for example, it's multiple different commodities that we're trying to look at here. So is that something that when we've been trying to incorporate ESG in a meaningful manner into the standards, is that something where there have been trying to make it so that it's applicable to all of those different areas? Has that been a challenge, or is it something that's yet to be tested?
Yeah, it's well, I think one of the changes, if I just refer to one of the changes that happened with the latest update of the Crisco template, was they're trying to separate out the commodity specific aspects into appendices so that the core code, if you like, should be applicable across a wide range of commodities. And in terms of our work on introducing the guidance on environmental, social and governance into it, we've mainly looked at what is section 13 in the 2019 Crisco template was entitled Sustainability Considerations. We're looking at retitling that as environmental, social and governance considerations, so as to highlight it as a major section in the updated PERC reporting standard. And then there is an accompanying in the template and the PERC reporting standard, there's an accompanying table 1, which is a sort of checklist of things that the people preparing reports should consider. And in parallel with having a fairly brief guidance in the main text of section 13, there would be additional guidance on table 1, the corresponding side of table 1 on that. And perhaps if I could just mention the one other change that we were going to make, which sort of arises from Kathryn's presentation, was that there should be reference to looking at modifying factors, particularly the environmental and social ones, right from the exploration stage onwards. And having started my working career as an exploration geologist and going and having to ask farmers in the Irish Midlands for permission to start drilling on their land, I'm aware that it's the exploration geologist is often the first person there on the ground, and they need to manage expectations, because you can maybe drill 100 exploration holes and only one will ever lead to anything further. So, you need to be aware of having, people thinking, oh, well, they're coming to drill, we're going to immediately have a mine, as realizing that it's all part of the data gathering, and there's a long drawn out process between initial exploration and actually having an operating mine.
So that's something which again came through very clearly in the previous roundtable that was had this morning, which was whilst traditionally perhaps ESG hasn't featured until actually fairly late on in the process, it needs to be considered right from the very beginning. Is that what you're saying there, Ed?
Yeah, I think that's what we would be indicating. And I mean, this is more for a sort of general discussion that as I worked for many years as a consultant geologist, and I would often have difficulty with the clients saying, you know, I'm just talking about mineral resources, what's there in the ground. They would say, oh, no, we don't need to worry about modified factors. You look at the diagram in the reporting templates, which we refer to as figure 1, it says you only need to apply the modified factors when you move from resources to reserves. But if you actually read the guidance in detail, you'll see in order to justify that what's in the ground has reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction, you have to look at environmental modifying factors. For instance, if a deposit is in a national park, it's highly unlikely that you'll get permission to make it a mine. So, you know, that would be a consideration if there's national park legislation, or you might have a major gold deposit under a major city. Well, you might not be able to to get the go ahead to do it. So, you know, that we're trying to bring that, or highlight that more. And you know, one consideration is, you know, should we redraw that figure 1 to indicate there's a sort of environmental social umbrella around it that you have to consider before you start going into too much depth with exploration results.
Brilliant. So I guess watch this space potentially, or at least some ideas that may be flying around with regards to that unofficially. So just in closing, Ed, from the PERC perspective, is there anything that the international community can do to help the update, or anything else that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, one of the criteria for being a member of Crisco is that if you are going to update your national reporting code or standard, you have to circulate it for comment to all the other Crisco members. So we would be aiming to do that anyway, because if any of the other Crisco members feel we're making a change that they're not happy with, that would sort of go against the overall grain of things. And I mean, we aren't, the main thing that would be tinkering with the definitions or whatever would probably be frowned on and objected to by others, quite rightly, where it's something we want to get consensus on. But in the light of these discussions, I have been thinking that there may be 1 or 2 questions. We might put out a general survey to the people who have been participating, just to get a feel. Obviously PERC has its own internal decision making, but one of the issues we have had discussions on, and it came up this morning, is the difference in meaning between governance and governmental. And a lot of people feel, governance may have specific legal meanings or meanings in a corporate sense. And, I think it's exactly what terminology should we use. That at the moment, the term governmental is included in the modified factors, but not governance. And, once again, I think a point I made this morning was, we're not telling the reporting codes and standards. Their remit isn't to tell people how the decision making should be done, but it's to inform investors and people who are interested in a particular company, what requirements they will need to follow. And so they may wish to report on what engagement they have done with local communities, so to try to avoid the situation where you may have an advanced project and then you find out that the local community is totally against it, and that's a big risk then to the future of the project, which may not have been identified properly in the reports that have been issued to the public in terms of investors and financiers. And
Brilliant. No, that absolutely fantastic, Ed. And thank you for teeing up our second discussion for today. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from your side of your muted microphones to say thank you very much to Ed for kickstarting our discussion and giving us some insight to PERC. So just while John unmutes his mic, we're now going to go to South Africa, which has been absolutely crucial with regards to PERC's update, because we very much lent on some of the fantastic work that the South Africans have been doing. So Tanya, Teresa and Roger, if you want to begin to appear, I will pass over to John for your introduction.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Ed, for the really good information there about PERC. And hello again, South Africa. Hope you've had a good day since we met earlier. I've been chewing over what we talked about this morning quite a lot, and I think you guys came up with some really good points to think about. Just to introduce SAM codes a little bit. There's several codes in South Africa used for reporting of mineral resources. SAMREC is the one that us mineral geologists or exploration geologists are most familiar with. A couple of key things here is that SAM ESG was developed by SAM codes specifically to provide standardized systematic framework for reporting of ESG matters. So that's been a really valuable resource for everybody within the Crisco family. And it was so good that they were awarded in 2009, they were awarded a honours award by the United Nations Intergovernmental Working Group for the realisation of the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainability Goals. So well done on that. That's really brilliant, and some good recognition there as to how the minerals industry can contribute to the SDGs, which is a really important matter. Just building on some of the points that you made this morning, I think it was some key things that stood out for me was a need to incentivize people to want to report on ESG. I think that's a really good point, which hopefully will bring in these sorts of matters at an earlier stage of the cycle. And that also builds on your comment and Ed's comment as well, that it needs to be applicable across the value chain, by which I interpret that to mean from the earliest stages of exploration all the way through to post-closure. So I think that's some consensus there on bringing in these factors throughout the exploration and mine development cycle. So yeah, thanks for those thoughts, and looking forward to hearing some more.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Tanya, I'm going to come straight to yourself again and just ask you for any opening comments, and perhaps explain to all of us what is SAM code, SAM ESG, SAM everything else, just so that we can get our head around this landscape. And then I'll pass across to Teresa, perhaps for some more detail on the ESG side.
Okay, the SAM codes is the South African Mineral Reporting Codes. It's a family of codes, and you can see in the list behind me, we look at the SAMREC, which is the resource and reserve estimating, and there's the SAMVAL, which is the valuation of mineral assets. We also have SAMOG, which is the oil and gas reporting section. So all of these three individual codes fall under the umbrella body, the South African umbrella body of SAM codes. In addition to these three reporting codes, we also have two guideline documents. One is the SAM-ESG that we're talking about today, and the other one is the reporting of diamond and other precious stones. That also falls directly under SAMREC, and it's just one of the commodity-specific reporting guidelines that Ed was also talking about in his presentation. Our latest update was in 2016, when we combined everything under the SAM codes banner. And one of the things that we concentrate on is trying to help our members understand what it is that they need to report and how best to do it. And in line with what we're talking about here today with guidance from ESG issues, we're also looking at the importance of providing guidance for other modifying factors, and specifically the integrated risk management, something that we also feel is lacking in many of the codes and has a great deal to do with information recovered from the ESG factors. As we mentioned earlier, another thing that we're concentrating on is how to sensitize our competent persons to the importance of ESG. We want people to comply with ESG, not simply because it's the right thing to do or because somebody has a big stick, but rather because it's something that they believe ought to be reported on in a responsible and sensible manner. Teresa and her committee have been doing a huge amount of work over the last couple of years, trying to make the SAMESC more applicable to all stakeholders, the big companies, the small companies, the juniors, the people with low budgets, the explorationists, and all the people that we've been speaking about. And that's exactly what they're doing at the moment, is updating this to make it more applicable across the board. And I will now shut up and Teresa can carry on.
No, please don't shut up, Tanya, because there's so much more that we could glean from you. But yes, let's take this opportunity to pass across to Teresa to maybe explain in a bit more detail what's been going on the environment, social and governance side.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Tanya. So yes, just one point to note, as Tanya mentioned, obviously SAMESC is a guideline that supports the SAM codes and is directly referenced at the moment in SAMVAL, and we're busy working on improving the references within SAMREG. We are also working with the SAMOG guys, but their process is quite different to obviously a hard rock mineral resources and reserves, and so we'll likely need to have a tailored section of SAMESC that sort of provides the guidance that the oil and gas guys need. But one of the advantages that we have of SAMESC being a guideline and not part of the actual codes is that we have a lot more flexibility to update the guideline on a regular basis, which is what we're obviously doing at the moment. Because we're a supporting document, we provide clarity and information, and we don't have to jump through the JSC sort of approval process in terms of getting the guideline updates approved, so we can be a lot more nimble in our updates, which is great for processes like this where all of us around the world are having these conversations and thinking about what to do. We have the flexibility to try and make SAM as up to date, as it can be to meet the needs of its users. So as Tanya mentioned, we are doing an update at the moment. The committee is working on trying to provide a lot more guidance for people. We've got a lot of technical requirements that are in SAMESC at the moment. I think anyone who's read SAMESC will agree that it is very repetitive the way it stands right now, and we're aware of that. We were trying to sort of say that it's very similar information that you need across the value chain, but at perhaps different levels of detail. But we're trying to say, okay, well, so what? If you have all this information, what does it actually mean for a CPR, for example? So that's the work that we're doing at the moment in conjunction with our sister committees under the SAM Codes umbrella.
So in terms of your focus on, okay, so what does this actually mean? Can you give us an example, perhaps in terms of some of the areas that might be changing, or is it too early to do that?
So it is too early, and we've sort of really got a very rough straw dog. We've taken the existing SAMESC, torn it apart, and tried to look at a different structure that would make it more user-friendly. But we're really trying to address some of the challenges between what SAMREG requires and how we can address that from a SAMESC perspective. Yeah, that's really the goal at the moment. And similarly with SAMVAL, because there's processes that SAMVAL undertakes that SAMESC would like to feed into, and we just need to make sure that we put things on the right hooks to, as it were, to make the process work better.
So with that, and final question, Teresa, for yourself before I come across to Roger, with SAMESC being a guideline rather than a core part of the code, does it have enough teeth to make it work and get people to use it? As in that balancing act of almost stick versus flexibility, how do you see that?
Yeah, so the stick part is not something that we have at the moment, and there's pros and cons on both sides. As you say, flexibility versus not having the stick. We are working to provide some carrots to incentivize people to align with SAMESC, and to that end, it's socializing it amongst the various stakeholders across various platforms, so not only with the competent persons, but also with the investors, so they can be asking the questions of people who are writing these reports to say, but you know, there's the SAMES guideline, why aren't you using it? The information would be of value to us. You know, tackle it from both sides. And then, as I say, a carrot to some kind of recognition for those companies that do it well. I see Tanya wants to say something, I think.
Yeah, no, Tanya, please hop in on that.
If I can just add on that, there's also discussions with the SAMREC committee to add certain is the base requirements from SAMESC into SAMREC, into the code itself. And so as Teresa said, one of the benefits of the guideline is that you can have both requirements as well as industry best practice. And then we'd like to take some of the requirements into the code, which will hopefully give it the teeth that you were talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And that's absolutely fantastic to hear. Just in terms of the carrot side of this, and apologies for anybody whose first language is not English. We're using lots of strange terms, but we've got one of our TAME representatives from the investment community who's just joined us, and we'll come to him later on just to hear how that carrot may be getting sweeter. And at that point, I'm going to stop with these analogies and just pass across to Roger, who is Mr. Crisco at the moment. Now, Roger, we're going to come back to you in a Crisco capacity, but given your location, etc., is there anything that you want to say with regards to the South African approach to all of this?
No, I will add a couple of things. Firstly, that we're very proud of our ESG guidelines and the awards that they've been given by the UN, and then I think Tanya did speak about integrated risk management. I think that there is scope for having a separate section on integrated risk management. And then what has been spoken about as well is, and it's particularly applicable, I think, in the African situation, is that these guidelines and standards must be in the context of the area in which they are implemented. You know, the size of the companies, the state of the project, the area. I mean, let's be honest, Western Europe is a lot different to the DRC and Cameroon and the likes of that. So you've got to take that into consideration when you're drawing up these standards. And then other ones which I will talk about on a Crisco basis. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Roger. I should also note for everybody listening in that whilst in my other half of my life, I run an integrated risk management consultancy, I did not plant any of that with the South African team, but that's very, very exciting to hear that that's one of those components coming through. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite you to put your hands together on the other side of your microphones and say thank you very much to Tanya, Teresa and Roger. Obviously, there's a huge amount more that we could talk about, but our Canadians are beckoning. So John, back to yourself to give a little intro to our Canadians. And Canadians, if you'd like to now turn on your videos and turn on your microphones. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks South Africa, and welcome back Canada, from one extreme to the other, summer to winter. So we had some really great information from your Canadian colleagues this morning, and really looking forward to seeing how you guys can build on that. So the CIM is probably best known in my mineral resource circles for the NI 43-101 instrument for reporting of mineral projects. It's quite a buzz term in the industry. Lots of people have heard of that. So it's quite a heavy-hitting code in that regard, and broadly adopted. Now they have developed some ESG best practice guidelines in 2017. And I think that there's some really interesting conversations to come from CIM, particularly with some of the feedback they've given on whether the G should be a separate part of the ESG. We should have ES and then G. I think that's a really important thing to discuss, and probably one of the areas under greatest debate at the moment. Should these reporting codes even be considering governance? Is it their place to do so? What even does governance mean? Are we talking about national governance or corporate governance, previously known as CSR? But also, what is we had some good discussions this morning about what is materiality when it comes to these sorts of factors. It's very easy to define with technical geological aspects and things, but maybe less so with when it comes to environmental and social governance factors. So yeah, over to you guys. I'm really interested to hear some more about those sorts of things.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, John. So obviously, as you can see on your screens, we have the fantastic Garth Kirkham, Greg Gosson and Ian Thompson with us today. This morning, we had a different cast, so please do feel free to go back and check on what they said this morning. I'm sure it's all going to be aligned. Also, please do feel free to keep your questions coming, and we will be trying to answer them in the background. But Garth, if I can come across to yourself first. So John mentioned that governance word, and I guess from a Canadian perspective, you guys have had loads of experience in terms of doing lots of governance and then thinking, well, actually that's really difficult to be able to incorporate in a meaningful way, and where should we sit with regards to the G of ESG? I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so just to give a little background on how the moving pieces as far as the Canadian context goes, is that we have 43-101, which is the law of the land, and that dictates the content and guidance and form in which mineral projects are disclosed to the public. And within 43-101, CIM is the organization that actually is the home of the definition standards, which are part of the Crisco family, but also there we create a whole range of best practice. And I'm going to say best practice and leading practice, and Ian, I'm sure will carry on that discussion in a bit. But it's we call it best practice because it's kind of more convenient. People kind of see that as we have all our different best practice. So the governance piece is actually, since CIM isn't a we don't register members as professionals. That's the provincial organizations that register professionals as a PGO or a PNG. And then from the company perspective, the governance piece, it's not, CIM doesn't have sway, I guess, over the companies. We're there to provide guidance. Whether that the governance piece is in there is we're kind of wrestling with it. I think the feeling is that it should be a complete package, complete piece. But there's also it's section 20 in 43-101 that is the ESG part. And if you look at go to the BC Securities Commission website, find 43-101. The guidance in section 20 is pretty skinny, and I think that was acknowledged, and we need to really up our game and try and be a leader in the ESG side. So that's kind of the background a bit, I guess. And it's really on the governance side, it's really all these the three pillars, I'll call it, are which one, where does it actually fall, and that's kind of my observation.
So with this, Garth, as well, and excuse me, in terms of the Canadian update, for example, or where Canada's going next, can you just give us a quick summary with regards to that? And then I'm going to come to Ian, not to talk about the term best practice, but maybe to discuss more on the social aspect, and especially with regards to, because we've got quite a few questions coming in around how can ESG and resource reserves address the rights of Indigenous people, etc. But Garth, if I just come back to you and just, is there what's going on with regards to the Canadian code at the moment, and are there any updates to be coming in the near future?
Well, 43-101 is updated on a fairly long timelines, whereas the CIM best practice and the definition standards, if Crisco makes a change, we're a little bit more nimble, so it's not it doesn't have to be a 10-year cycle. So and because the definition standards, CIM definition standards, are the law of the land, whereas the best practice is you should be using CIM or other industry best practice. So the current the current effort on the ESG best practice is about 3 years in now. So there are a lot of components. So there's I think it's a group of 20 professionals that are really doing the grunt work on it, and so we're fairly far along now. There's been a lot of backing and forthing, but I think there's confidence that we'll have something out this year, and yeah, it's I think it so far it's been a long road, but I think well worth it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Garth. Really exciting to see. So Ian, just coming across to yourself with regards to, I guess, where we begin to see the true impact of this making a difference. I don't know if you've got any examples from the social side of things.
There's much to be talked about here. I'm not quite sure where to begin. But yes, the social side is somewhat different. We talk about E, environment, S, social, and G, governance. I see governance as an essential linking element here. And we'll look back to the fact that the industry is by and large compliance driven. It will follow the rules, and it certainly follow the law. The environmental side of things has more than 20 years more experience than in the social side. Environment became a key part of things, adopted into the industry in the 80s after a struggle, a real struggle. Didn't really want to do that sort of thing, but it became adopted into the industry, and it came with a framework. There are environmental laws and regulations that have reasonable parity around the world. They're broadly comparable, and that provides a structure and a rationale for doing a whole lot of things. Social doesn't have that. It's the newcomer on the block, and there isn't a legal framework, or at least not very much of a legal framework to underpin it, and is often seen as something that would be, I can't say optional, but you respond to the situation on the ground. So good guidance would be very important for that sort of thing, and certainly some communality around that. And if we had a global governance body giving people some idea of what they should be doing, that would be very, very useful. But on the social side, I believe that governance, and particularly governance at the project level, which is where the rubber hits the road, is really very important. And by governance, I'm talking about the policies and the procedures and the mechanisms of accountability at the project level within the corporation, and accountability to external stakeholders, which would include shareholders, communities, regulators, governments, etc. They're very, very important, because they're the key elements that will tell you whether or not there is some reasonable confidence that the company is performing to its best abilities, or and in response to the reality on the ground. So it really, I think, is an important part. Governance is an important part of putting these things together. I'm going to stop there, because I think that there are other things to talk about here. So let's get. Oh no, you did ask about where do things like free, prior, and informed consent come in? That's a very, very important question. It's a burning question here. Ideally, from a First Nations or an Indigenous people's point of view, it happens at day one, and that's long before there are reserves and resources. That would be the day that the geologist first turns up on the project. For many on the corporate side, this doesn't become, for them, a priority until they've got something in the ground, which is probably when the resources start to become reserves, and there is some reality. I say, well, when there's something real here, then we'll talk about it, we'll get serious. So there's a gap there. There's a gap that is going to continue to be a very controversial part of the relationship of the mining industry to Indigenous people.
So I think that that's a case where we acknowledge there's a gap. Are there solutions? There are many different ways in which it can be approached, but it isn't simple. Would that be okay to say, Ian?
Oh, I think that's okay to say, yes.
I say being very loose with it.
Yeah, no, we've, the Social Practice Forum just yesterday put out a practitioner's thought piece on FPIC. From a practitioner's point of view, it is the gap that has to be recognized and filled somehow. Otherwise, conflict will continue. And let's not forget that the mining industry in many parts of the world is inherently in a conflictive environment because of the reality of severed title, where you, the mining company, or they, the mining company, has an agreement with the state or as the owner of the subsurface resource. There's a third party there, which are the owners, or those that believe they are the owners or have some usufruct right to the surface, saying, well, what about us? Where do we fit into this?
Which makes it very complicated.
Inherently so, yes. But exactly. Always challenging and always interesting too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ian. I'm just going to round off on Team Canada with Greg, who's also going to stay with us for Team USA. But Greg brings with him the perspective from the regulator. So, Greg, I know we had a fantastic conversation over the weekend with regards to this, but I just wondered if you could comment on what is the impact of 43-101 at the moment, especially with regards to that section 20, which is the ESG section, and where do you see there need to be perhaps some updates coming in as fast as possible with regards to that?
Yeah, 43-101 has become a brand, and it's helped the Canadian industry immensely. It's given credibility to their information and a framework for disclosure, sort of a common disclosure document. People understand the 43-101 technical reports, including the section 20, where the environmental, social, other environmental aspects, infrastructure of the project are discussed. And so there's this expectation that the information they need to know about a project is in that report, and that it's been properly prepared by a qualified person, and therefore it should be reliable. It should contain the material information, and so it has all those expectations around it. But when projects advance to a certain stage and then run into some kind of difficult occurrence with either environmental or social, the communities are not happy with what's going on, and there's an obstruction to progressing with the project. And they look back at the technical reports and say, well, there's sufficient information in there for the investor to have understood those risks. Was the information meaningful? Was it specific enough? Because sometimes these statements, these summary technical reports, are very much summarized with certain expectations that everything will go in a straightforward way, and many projects don't. The project changes over time, the expectations of the communities change, the environmental issues become highlighted, and you add into the design of the project, and that can have a big impact on costs, and that can have a big impact on the timeline for being able to advance. So the expectation around 43-101 is this magical document that has all of the information and it's all been properly prepared. Well, I think it does a pretty good within the understanding of the dynamics of the mining industry projects. So the other thing is, when that information is prepared, there's this expectation of trust with the community and confidentiality, in the sense that you're discussing with community leaders and interested parties with the project, and you're trying to establish trust. They want to understand your project, you want to understand their concerns, and see if you can manage that and maybe even change certain aspects of the project to mitigate those concerns of the community. And they don't want to be reading about that. This is, important that has to go on with this expectation of a certain amount of confidentiality. Yet the company is also bound to investors what their plans are, how they're managing these risks and expectations that they need to navigate through for obtaining their social license, whatever that document looks like. And they're trying to put this in a summary form into a tech report in an easy form for investors to understand and then rely on when they're investing in the company. And there's the tension. So how much do they put in there? How are they potentially undermining the communication with the community if they're too transparent about discussions that are going on? And the other side of it is, this is law in Canada. So these reporting codes, as you call them, 43-101, is a form of reporting. And then it relies on these definitions, which become part of the code and guidelines. But in Canada, because it's law and under the capital markets, they have civil liability. And what they do is they say those responsible for preparing the information and disclosing it to the public are then civilly liable for any misrepresentations or any information in there that has been omitted or other material information that's wrong. And maybe that's just they were too optimistic on certain statements. And this is material information for the most part, then they're actually civilly liable to investors. So if investors suffer harm because they relied on that information, not identify that there was a significant issue that only is going to happen a year or two in advance when they get to a more significant part of the permitting process, and investors can say, well, you didn't properly inform me, and they can then sue the company for that. And built into the Securities Act has the civil liability provisions, which makes it much, much easier for investors to sue companies. That's how they try to make people who are responsible for preparing the information take those responsibilities seriously. They make them in civil court. They can sue under the Securities Act. And they offer the companies and the qualified persons who prepare this information defenses against that liability. And what they say is, one of the defenses is the common term is the due diligence defense. And it says, if you did what a reasonable person would have done, your peers, what would they have done in a similar circumstance? And that's a defense against that liability, meaning in spite of your best efforts and in spite of good industry practices, you still had a problem with getting your permits or getting your on side with your project, the stakeholders. And so you can't be found liable for those damages. Yes, this issue did. You tried to avoid that, and you presented that information in a transparent way for investors to understand the process you were following.
So with that, sorry, just on that, Greg. So I know we're going to ask you similar questions when we get to the US side, and apologies for interrupting. Apologies for interrupting your flow. There's sometimes your microphone, by the way, breaks up a little bit, just to let you know that. Okay. I'm aware that the likes of, so Ontario did a review of some of the 43-101 reports in terms of the adequacy with which they were presented. I don't know if you could comment quickly on that, and then we will segue elegantly south of the border to the US.
Yeah, well, I'll just finish there. One of the provisions in the Securities Act for the defense is if you follow best practice guidelines or the industry accepted practices by your professional association standards in the industry, then that is a defense against civil liability. So the importance of these guidelines here now at CIM will have big implications to the practitioners who are preparing this information and to the company disclosing it. Because if they can show that they actually followed what were considered to be by the association, or the CIM is the designated standards of Canada, and if they're saying these are the standards you should follow, and here's some reference documents, if you can show you did that, then you can build your civil liability defense. I just thought I would emphasize that aspect of how significant everything is integrated here. Having an efficient capital market and a credible capital market, and having people involved in the mining industry and having confidence that they're doing the right things, and if something does go wrong, that they have a defense that they can say that if they follow certain practices, something goes wrong, that they won't lose their house and lose the wealth, or the company won't be sued into oblivion, because they have reasonable defenses they can offer. And these best practice guidelines are part of it. And so what happened with this, Ontario Securities Commission reviewed 50 technical reports with a range of development scales on projects. And they found that 80% of the technical reports were compliant. And that seemed to cause a lot of concern in industry and in the media. People felt that all of those reports filed on CEDAR should be fully compliant. That's the expectation. It's a very difficult, in hindsight, to look back and say, are those reports fully compliant? Of those 80% that were not compliant, half of those, 40% of the total, had serious compliance issues. And they went through and they ranked what were the different content in the report that had compliance issues. And the environmental, social, the chapter 20, section 20 of the tech report was one of the ones. And about a third of them, they felt did not provide adequate disclosure to meet the requirements. And as Garth said, the requirements are actually fairly skinny anyway. But even then, they didn't meet those limited requirements to fully comply with what the form required. And so that puts those companies at risk that if something goes wrong with the project later, that if they didn't provide the required content, that's going to undermine their ability to defend themselves if something later goes wrong on the environmental or social permitting side of the project. So again, the best practice guidelines were, and that's part of the role of the CIM, they were motivated to say, we need to provide better guidance for a framework for disclosure to support companies who are deciding what they must disclose. So these aren't disclosure standards that the CIM committee is doing. These are best practice guidelines, practice standards. And say, if these are the practices you should have, and this is the type of information, and this is the objectives of those practices, then the company will be in a better position to properly summarize that in a technical. And then if something does go wrong, they'd be able to say, well, we met the requirements under the code, and we met the requirements under the best practice guidelines. Therefore, we should be found not liable if something goes wrong. I'm just pointing out that one aspect, which is an important part of the capital market. Civil liability risk is a significant. It's sued for hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars, because projects get derailed at a late stage after a huge investment, commitment, a lot of expectations, and often it is over environmental or social reasons that these projects get derailed.
So absolutely fantastic, and thank you very much for that description there, Greg, and that explanation with regards to I guess, again, the teeth that we have here actually to make sure that people do this properly. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Team Canada. I know that Ian dipped out, but he came back to us again, which is brilliant. So round of applause for Team Canada. And we are going to gently nip over the border to the US. So John, would you like to give us a quick introduction to the US while we flick over videos, and then we'll hear from the lovely Stella.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Canada. Fascinating insights there. I particularly enjoyed Ian's thoughts on good social practice from the outset. That's certainly something that we're starting to instill in our geologists here at SRK Exploration, just with some success. So that's great to hear that. Lots of talk there from Greg about liabilities and things, which is all a bit scary, but it's crucial that we discuss it. So, which leads us actually nicely to the US, where they have a relatively new regulation, which was formally adopted in February 2019. It's known as SK 1300, the Modernisation of Property Disclosures for Mining Registrants. Now, a big difference here compared to some of the other codes that are joining us today is that whilst those are codes or guidance instruments, SK 1300 is a law which is enforced by the US Security Exchange Commission. So I think the importance of these best practice guidelines, is following what Greg was saying, is becomes even more pertinent here. Maybe the US has the sharpest teeth of the lot in that regard, and I'd certainly be fascinated to hear how ESG guidelines can be incorporated into it with that in mind. So thanks very much, and over to you, Sarah and Stella.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. So Stella, would you like to just start off by giving us a brief overview with regards to your fabulous new code standard that we have here, and maybe some of the background to it?
Greg, I might get you to switch on your microphone again as well, just to chime in. So in 2018, in fact, it was the SEC passed the new disclosure standards, but they didn't actually get promulgated across into the Federal Register until early 2019. And so they became law and binding on all mining exploration companies as of 1st of January this year. And that actually is now law that the US and foreign registrants listed on the various US exchanges have to follow when undertaking mining disclosures to the public. So much of what's covered in the new regulation is said by the SEC to be Crisco compliant, but there's also a number of topics of particular interest to the SEC themselves that they've woven in and out and throughout the SEC guidelines. So for nearly 40 years, the US used a code called Industry Guide 7. It was fairly simplistic. It was a guideline. It actually wasn't binding. It was just simply, the SEC asked you to do it. They would point to that particular document and they would expect you to follow. With SK 1300's promulgation, now we have a law. The document itself is about 400 pages, of which about the first 300 discusses the reasoning why the SEC came down on certain decisions and certain methods of presentation, and about 20 pages of it actually is what is required to actually comply with public disclosures in certain areas, and there's about another 2 pages that actually cover the content requirements of what's called a technical report summary, which is the SEC's version of a technical report under NI 43-101. So one of the things I wanted to bring out, if I could, was that ESG disclosure is still voluntary in the US for all industries other than mining, but there's a lot more pressure to have these types of disclosures from institutional investors. So I'm expecting to see that as more of these technical report summaries come out into the public domain, that you'll see pressure coming on to other aspects within the United States to start conforming and bring themselves in line with what's required of the mining companies. So I also want to bring up the fact that, to me, ESG considerations for mining are really wide-ranging. So under the E, I see things like climate change, biodiversity, waste, water, land, and resource uses, pollution. So this would be things like acid rock drainage, your metals leachings, your air quality, visual quality, landscapes, archaeology, local history. So quite a wide range of things that mining companies have to think about under the E. Under the S, with things like human rights, labour practices, safety, health, community, diversity, whether or not the companies had a lot of violations and fines where inspectors have been through and actually visited their sites and seen issues, and obviously community outreach. Under the G, I would normally see things like corporate government, ethics, compliance, executive pays, diversity again, lobbying and taxation to be considerations that would need to be there. So many of these topics I just listed off are covered as part of the required disclosures, actually as part of the technical report summary, or as actual parts of the reporting that companies must do as an annualised basis to the SEC and to their investors. So some of those are covered in there quite clearly, and those would be the E and the S. I find that the more stringent internal controls requirements in SK 1300 actually are pretty likely to address quite a bit of the G, and you'll certainly find a lot of information around ethics, around compliance, around the violations and fines, your diversity, your executive pay, actually required to be at least partially discussed, if not more fully discussed. In referring back to what Kathryn was talking about earlier this morning and started this particular one, when she was showing that there were certain times of certain studies where certain information comes in. Well, the SEC have actually put their long fingers into that as well. And so you now have prescriptive and scaled requirements for study documents, which start out with an actual general requirement for what's called an initial assessment, which is a document you must have in the background before you can report resources. And that has very, very specific requirements as to what you can and cannot have ready when you're actually looking at what you need to have for an IA. So I'm going to say for here, so for just even before you go anywhere else, by the time you get to the resources, you've got to have a list of the required permits and agencies drawn. You've got to determine if you've got significant obstacles to obtaining permits. You've got to identify all your pre-mining land uses. You've got to assess the requirements for baseline studies. You have to assume your post-mining land uses, your tailings disposal, reclamation and mitigation plans. So that's now going quite a lot further than most of the other codes globally. And because you must have these as part of law in the background, I think you're going to see a lot of companies in the United States, particularly this year, running around in circles to make certain they can actually meet those requirements, even before they get to reserves. These are things you need to think about for resources. When you get to PFS and FS, the requirements become even more prescriptive and even more deliberative in terms of what you must have addressed. And the SEC sets these out as at a minimum you must have. So it's not even like you've got some interpretation there, you must have those.
So with that, Stella, then, in terms of, I guess, the consequences of this, kind of very prescriptive documentation, I guess, in a way, coming through, are we going to see some mining assets be, say, devalued quite significantly because they don't have this, or that they can't prove it at the moment? What kind of changes do you think might be happening there?
I think you will see people making quite deliberate decisions as to whether or not the resources they've always carried under IG7 will actually be applicable to carry under SK 1300. And certainly I think these requirements to have the IA, PFS and FS that meet what the SEC wants. Remember that most other to my knowledge, all other countries globally don't actually have these specific requirements as to cost accuracies, content requirements, so on, specified as part of your law. You have a fair bit of leeway to decide, well, in my particular case, I'm an aggregates company. I don't necessarily need to do that because certain positions you've got in there just don't apply to me.
Okay. So you might see people looking for some of the loopholes, but hopefully, of course, taking on board the intent with regards to the ESG component along with everything else. Greg, are there any brief words you'd like to add to Stella's fantastic summary there?
No, I think Stella's covered quite a lot. The issue over internal controls is something that is emphasized by the SEC, and this goes to governance. And it's the idea, and I think it was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, that you have different levels of corporate governance and governance over the project level, and then you even have governance over certain processes. And the way we see it, and we do these audits of companies, is governance is a system in place to maintain the integrity of a process. And when it comes to the SEC's new standard, the SK 1300, they're talking about the process of mineral exploration, mineral resource estimation, mineral reserve estimation. Those are the processes they're referring to. And they want to see internal controls over the process, which means a governance system. And that means you have procedures in place, you have checks in the system, you have oversight. And this also feeds back into civil liability defense, that if you have a good internal controls over your process, then you can show that as one of your due diligences. And even under the Canadian and parts of the US law, that gives you another defense, that you have a disclosure control procedure in place and you have good controls over your internal processes. That is, again, a defense against civil liability. So all these things, again, are interrelated. And the US has their Sarbanes-Oxley law for corporate governance, reporting on their internal controls, on financial reporting. The audit firms are being pushed to get more involved in reviewing resources and reserves because they are part of the financial reporting for mining companies. They feel they're being too accepting of just saying if the company has reserves, and for impairment testing, depreciation, amortization. So all of these things they're looking for, similar to what they do for financial reporting, the internal controls, the governance over that. They want to see that for operational reporting, for the business reporting. and in particularly for mineral projects, resources and reserves.
So with that then, and for anybody on the call, so Sarbanes-Oxley is the financial side of things within the US. It's very prescriptive and is one of the reasons why you often see very large departments that are dedicated to being able to meet the requirements of SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. So Stella, if I can come back to you, and we've had a great question that's just come in from one of our attendees who, and they say, so if SK 1300, do we think that SK 1300 is likely to be avoided by competent persons and consultants as a result of it being pretty terrifying? So do you think the fact that it's got so much teeth might actually put people off and they might prefer to use one of the other options? What do you think?
There are no other options if you are a US-based company or you're registered on a US exchange. You're going to have to comply. So, you know, whether or not you feel comfortable with complying, the company itself will have to comply. Yes, anecdotally from SME, so Society for Mining, Metallurgy and Exploration, of which I'm a member, we are hearing of people who are saying they're very grateful that they're only 2 or 3 years off retirement and that they will never be involved with this type of a study. We are seeing other consultancies say, look, if we manage this properly, I think there is a way around it and a way we can do it, because we can see what Canada's done. And if we are very careful about how we do it, we will be in there. And there are law firms, and law firms always win. Law firms always get the money. And there are law firms out there who are making themselves into boutique answers, whereby the lawyers will control the shots and the geologists, the mining engineers, the metallurgists, the environmental specialists will be contracted to those law firms. And I can see them being used as cannon fodder to actually pull these reports together. I hate to use that and be that blunt, but I can see some of the legal firms actually making certain that they hire people who are maybe not as familiar with the legislation and some of the nasty teeth in there as the lawyers are, and then they would become the front for that particular one.
So just to be clear on this then, Stella, so the company must comply, but would an independent consultant that is supporting that company, would the consultants be liable, or is it the company?
Both would be liable.
Okay. So
the company is required to choose their qualified person. The company can choose a qualified person from within inside the company. Unlike Canada, there's no independence requirement in the United States, so your own corporate people can do it. But there are a few safeguards for independent qualified persons where they're able to rely on the registrar of the company itself for certain portions of information.
Okay.
Environmental is one of those aspects. So the social environmental can be relied on by the company. And then under the Securities Act and the Exchange Act, the civil liability provisions don't apply to the qualified person for those sections if they relied on the registrant, the company, for that. And that was made clear in the tech report summary. It's put in a separate chapter, chapter 25 of the tech report summary. The information that you're allowed to rely on from the company, you can identify there, and that makes the qualified person not liable for that information if it's later used in support and of a form filed under the Securities or Exchange Act or a registration statement.
So Sarah, may I just ask one quickly? I don't want to take up too much time because I know you've still got other countries. One of the things that I wanted to answer, there was a question on your board this morning about if somebody actually became a competent person under the AusIMM or JORC or AIG, is that normally reciprocal across? And I just wanted to say that the SME actually is one of those organisations where our registered member category, we actually have a specific category where you are a recognised member in the competency actually of environmental, and that environmental actually is includes both permitting and social licence. So when you apply for your registered member status, there is actually facility to actually apply actually with your expertise in a particular area.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have stunned silence from many people in the audience who now realise that they're going to have to be really, really on it with regards to doing anything in the US, etc. But that's fantastic because we actually need all of this to have teeth and need people to do it. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from our wonderful team from the USA. Round of applause. Thank you very, very much. Great. So with that, John, I'm going to come back to yourself and invite Roger Dixon to come to our table again. I know we already saw Roger a little while ago in his capacity of being in South Africa, but we're going to invite Roger back just to say a few words from the Crisco perspective, and before we then pass to our final guest, who's Jamie Strauss, who's actually going to provide a couple of words from the perspectives of investors. So yes, we're going to have somebody who's not a geologist just say a couple of words with regards to this. But John, over to yourself for the eloquent segue.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the USA. That was really quite something, and going to be very interesting to see how the more subjective aspects of ESG, particularly the social side, fit into all of that if they're adopted. So watch that space. So welcome back, Roger. Thanks for coming to join us again to represent Crisco this time. So as Ed explained earlier on, Crisco is the body to which all of the people that are speaking here today belong to. So it's I think the Crisco is the organisation that adopts various codes as they come in from these codes around the world, and it was provide a template, the templates for reporting, and which was last updated in November 2019 after 5 years of discussion. So Crisco has quite a big job in managing a lot of information that's coming in from all sorts of different places in the world, lots of different contexts, and pulling it together into a coherent template. And I think that's a really interesting point to discuss hopefully later on, is how we come to something coherent and can be internationally applied with respect to ESG, which is so very variable around the world. There's so many different contexts. So thanks very much, and over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, John. So Roger, I'm going to pass this ball straight across to yourself, and based on that fantastic introduction there from John, do you have any words from the Crisco perspective?
Yeah, as John said, we concluded the latest template, which is, as Ed said, is available on a Crisco website, and that we've decided that the update is going to take place on a 5-year cycle. It is very difficult to meet that, a 5-year cycle, bearing in mind that we're not just talking about ESG, we're talking about all the other aspects as well. And this international conversation that you have on the ESG has obviously given us a lot of food for thought on how we actually, go about updating the template. And we have at the moment, we have a working group, and I'll be the first to admit that doesn't work too well. And we will be looking to you to share with us how this, you've set up this particular process. The question always arises whether Crisco is a leader or a follower. And in this particular case, it has to be a follower, and it takes the best from each individual code as they are revised. And for the 2009 edition, we had the benefit of the SAMREC update, the PERK, the SME, and some of the JORC from its earlier edition. And ESG, we did attempt to include it in the latest template, but weren't very successful. A lot more focus has obviously come on ESG, but we named it Sustainability Considerations, and we took most of the content from the SME guide. And obviously, we like to keep our newer members updated on all the changes that are happening. And so I think it's important that we, as we said before this meeting started, that we include our Latin American members in this discussion on ESG. Just listening to this morning and to this evening's discussions, I think one of the most important things for me, which we need to address, is the definition of governance. I mean, this morning we had, I think it was Joe, who, you know, he brought another one. It was project governance. We've got corporate governance. We've got social governance, which is in the template at the moment. So I think we need to just define what exactly we're talking about in this. The other questions that I have, we mentioned integrated risk management and the context. And somebody has just, I think Stella just mentioned it. You know, we've recently, the global standards on tailings management has just been issued. And in that, there are 15 reporting requirements on an annual basis that companies have to subscribe to. And I just posed the question whether we don't need to have a separate discussion and inclusion of waste disposal facilities, not only tailings dams, but rock dumps and the like. And then also, as has been mentioned previously, very pertinent questions at the moment: climate change, carbon emissions, water management, which on the African continent is vital, and then mine closure. It probably all fits in with ESG, but I'll just raise it so that it's on your radar. And that's with that, I'll just say I congratulate you and your team on the way you presented this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Roger. And I think as you very eloquently summed up there are a plethora of different areas where I think we see really fantastic progress being made around the world, and forums like this where we can share from one another and listen to very different perspectives as well, especially on the Q&A. There's been some fantastic questions going on in the background, all of which are fabulously useful for the broader discussion. So thank you very much for that, Roger. Round of applause for the Crisco perspective. And then we're now going to neatly leap out of the world of that mineral focused reporting, although of course we're going to ask him to comment on it, and invite Jamie Strauss, who Jamie, maybe if you want to provide a little bit of background to yourself with regards to this area. And so Jamie is not a geologist, but he is someone who fundamentally believes in the power of ESG within the rocks, and what we do with regards to the rocks. And he's going to bring some of that pull that we're getting now, increasingly so, from the investment community. Jamie's also a non-executive director on at least one mining company, and so knows the sector incredibly well. So Jamie, if you want to turn your video on and unmute yourself so that you can come to the stage and maybe just give your perspective from the investors. Is ESG worth it? i.e., do you want to see the mining companies do it? And what comments might you have?
Okay, Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the whole team for this fascinating roundtable. And I think this roundtable kind of almost explains exactly the kind of major problem. It is so complex, this industry, and it's perhaps not surprising that we've taken quite a long time to bring all this together. And I take my hat off to everybody here, many of you who I've either met or know, in presenting here and hopefully bringing clarity to the investors who are so critical. And I'm going to come back to the investors in the future, just at the end of what I'm going to say here. But I think initially what I just wanted to comment on is that, I mean, frankly, is it worth it? It's definitely worth it. I think ESG, I think, is not new to the mining industry. The mining industry has been practicing ESG in some form or another for decades or even longer. Social license was the word we all used to use. But it's a matter of how it's disclosed, how it's written into the codes, which all of you are busy working away, how it's interpreted, and ultimately how it is then impacts the goals with which we're trying to do. And I think that in itself is complex. It's not just global warming, or it's not just governance. It's a matter of a number of different things which investors are now focusing on. And what I find hugely encouraging is they're focusing on the benefits with which it's going to have, not just from a governmental point of view, but in terms of analyzing companies and taking practices, well, not just policies, but practices forward to have a better managed company, mitigate risk, and have better outcomes. And I think you're beginning to see, I mean, I think it's proof now in the world generally, but I think even in the mining industry, you're beginning to see evidence of investors identifying those companies which have better practices than others. And that will ultimately lead to a difference of return on capital, which will ultimately lead to some companies being valued differently to other companies. So I think my basic comment would be, this is really encouraging. I think ESG in particularly the last 12 months, but I think over the last 2 to 3 years is a really encouraging movement within the mining industry. But there is a lot to do. I was on one of my 3 boards. I was in a meeting in January of last year, one of the last face-to-face meetings we had, where the board was discussing how we can improve our ESG, and they suddenly Googled ESG and suddenly came up and said, oh wow, what do we do? How do we do it? Where do we do it? Whom do we report to? And it's a complete confusion in terms of ESG disclosure. So there's a lot we can do to improve that for the industry, and many of you are doing that work together. But the capital providers, which is where this is leading down from, and it's going down a waterfall, and it started, I wouldn't say it started, I guess, with government and many of you taking on that approach, but it is really starting with regards to where it's getting active is with the capital providers. And I can safely say that there has been a huge tidal wave move, not just within capital providers across other industries, but a huge tidal wave move in the mining industry within the last 12 to 18 months. And they are fully engaged. And I second what Stella was saying earlier with some of the focus on where some of these investors are now doing it. And we obviously welcome some of the moves made more recently in the US along that line as well. So, but we are at an early stage. This is still immature. It's hugely complex. It's very inefficient in many ways. The capital providers are all doing their own assessments individually. Therefore, the companies themselves are having to answer multiple questionnaires, many of which are not asking the right questions, and which are very diverse in the way they're being approached. A typical fund manager relative to a private equity group, for instance, would be a completely different approach. So it's a very inefficient approach with which we're coming from at the moment, and a very immature way, which obviously needs to come together. From the point of view of the underlying fund managers, there's a lack of comparison, and we all know with regards to investment, everything relates down to a relative position. So if you can't easily compare one against another, that obviously limits the impact with which the movement of ESG or ESG disclosure can have with regards to the capital markets and ultimately the return rate of return or the rate of capital. I was on a call earlier today with BlackRock with their stewardship team, and BlackRock's focus. So you may have seen the latest email or letter to shareholders by Larry Fink, the CEO, on this, and they've been one of the leaders, certainly from a kind of standing on a plinth basis. And BlackRock are ingraining ESG more and more and more into their processes of investment across their entire diverse range of investment themes. And specifically within the mining space, they understand that mining can add huge value to the world, but they need to get that real data. If you read that letter, it's all about how to get detailed data with regards to ESG. And it's really important that they bring in that data in order to analyze it and therefore ultimately have a result of putting out investments into different companies. And that's not by any means limited to BlackRock. I mean, this is going across the whole swathe of the investment world, certainly in the Western world, and I would argue probably wider than that as well. I think the other thing I would say, and probably finishing on this, is the impact that this could have on the mining industry driven by the investment world. I have spoken to lots of ESG related funds and impact investors. Almost exclusively, they do not invest in mining. Some of them are not allowed to, some of them are allowed to but choose not to. So the huge tidal wave of money that has gone into these investment themes in particularly the last 24 months, but longer than that, is basically like a jet stream going above the industry. We are being completely ignored by huge new pools of capital. And Ivan Glassenberg, who recently was interviewed on the FT Commodities Day, highlighted about his retirement that he was looking to go into a sector, or a new sector which he didn't disclose, that it's going to be properly valued, as opposed to the mining industry, which has no real value. It doesn't have a strong currency with which to use from its paper. And I think it's trading at the moment in certainly less than tobacco, and has the potential to be substantially greater value than that. So really where I'm coming at is, having spoken to these ESG and impact investors, there is no reason in their mind that if they can credibly track companies and the industry at large with regards to their ESG credentials, and they have confidence that these companies are moving in the right form of direction, and at the same time that they're persuaded that mining can be part of the sustainable future, then the industry has got a really, really bright future in terms of new investment and improvement in its valuation, and ultimately for jobs, which we need to definitely improve on, because there's a serious shortage of younger people coming into this industry. So I think that's probably a rather long answer to your question, Sarah, but hopefully that gives a round view, an encouraging view of where the investment community is, but with a long way still to go before we can really feel as though we've won the game.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jamie. And as you say, a long way to go, but very encouraging. Now, I know that John has one burning question that he'd like to ask you very, very quickly before we go into our final sum up. John.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Jamie. That was really, really great to get your insights from the other side of the fence. I'm going to come at it from someone who's involved day to day with the early stages of mineral exploration, working with primarily junior exploration companies. And the current business model that they work on is to maximize the value of their exploration projects by defining resources in the most cost-effective way. For example, usually with their exit point of selling it on or merging with a larger group that's capable of taking it forward. Now, we also do quite a lot of valuations for these sorts of organizations. And one thing that I'm thinking about a lot these days is how to reflect the value add that good ESG performance can bring to a company. It's relatively easy for us to do that in respect of drilling meters or geophysical surveys and things like this. But I think a really interesting subject probably for another roundtable is how ESG can add value to a junior company. So I think that is what it will take for them to really adopt it and to take notice of it, because their eyes are always on the the exit and maximising their financial gains. And sorry, it's not so much of a question as a comment, really, but it would be interesting to know if the likes of Samval and Valmin are considering how they could introduce ESG into their valuation reporting guidelines as well.
Well, I'll answer that. And full disclosure, I'm the founder and CEO of Digby, which is in the next few weeks, in partnership with Satala, with Sarah, we are launching a series of ESG frameworks, simply put, exploration, development and producing. And the idea is for them to be right-sized and appropriate for the different status of each company, because many of the codes have been written, now talking about the kind of SASBs, GRIs, IFC codes, Equator, etc. Many of those codes were written for the producers as opposed to the majority of companies, which are of course exploration and development, as you just highlighted. Look, I think the important thing is that while that was a full disclosure point of view, and this is not a commercial argument, I was approached by BlackRock, Orion, and others this time last year to come up with a solution for the junior miners to address the underlying confusion and problems for that. So, to come to your point, John, is that it is important to try and come up with something which these companies can readily access to add value to them as well as to the capital providers, and to ensure that they get on board this early, so that the risk is minimized for themselves, but also the risk is minimized further down the cycle when majors or mid caps come in and effectively acquire them, and therefore don't want to get in and find a problem, in terms of their ESG history, so to speak. So I think we all know with this industry it's a very large cycle. So we need to address that.
Brilliant. So with that, just in the interest of time, because we have mere minutes left, ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for the fantastic Jamie Strauss? As you can hear, he is a font of knowledge when it comes to this, and he regularly appears on similar panels to this one. So I'm sure we can direct him or you to him in the future. So thank you very much for that, Jamie. Round of applause, and thank you for bringing the investor focus to that. So now what we're going to do in the final few moments of this workshop is just bring back Kathryn and Ed, so that is InFact and Perk, to join us just to provide some of their summary thoughts and comments from the roundtables that we've held over the course of the last however many hours it's been, the last 10 hours or so when we did both of the two roundtables. So Kathryn, maybe if we come to yourself first for any final comments or thoughts, and then we'll go to Ed and then to John.
Okay, thanks. Listening sort of from this morning and then this afternoon, I'm reminded of a conversation I had sort of with Ian Thompson sort of a couple of years ago, in that the social issues, the social understanding, the social context, having effective stakeholder engagement from the outset should be seen as an investment rather than a cost. And so when I say that, while we have someone like Jamie sort of on around the table as well, you cannot, the number of projects that get stopped because of social conflict, because of the prep wasn't done in the first place, and a lot of it could have been avoided just through having effective sort of consultation engagement. That, and then the other one really in terms of the FPIC discussion, there have been a bit of a Q&A sort of chat going on around that as well, and a lot of interest in the social practice forum piece, Ian, which you'll be very pleased to know. It's great to see that. But FPIC, should it be one-off or should it be continuous? And that's just really where I'd like to leave it now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kathryn. Ed, comments from yourself, and then we'll go to John.
Yeah, well, I just have brief thank everyone who's involved in pulling this all together, and all the people who participated in the different panels and stayed listening to us for all this time. I suppose just from what was said earlier, I'd like to pick up on some remarks that Greg and Stella made about, the sort of defense in terms of using best practice guidelines. And, as Perk is a grouping of 6 professional associations, I think, the professional association should perhaps pay more attention to the needs of their professional members in terms of developing these guidelines and practices so that they, avoid these pitfalls of being taken to court or whatever. And, professionals as well, all the ones who are members of Crisco should be abiding by a code of ethics and conduct. And, I'd remind professionals to refresh themselves on their code of conduct and ethics, because I think we all want to do good and not be deliberately misleading people or accidentally causing harm through mining. And we all rely on the products of mining in our daily lives in terms of our phones, our cars, our buildings, our motorways, and so forth.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Ed. And John, final comments from yourself.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's just been a fantastic couple of roundtables. I've learned so much, and to get these insights from all over the world has been a really unique, very valuable experience. So thank you for inviting me and for organising this. I think my parting shot, I suppose, is to do with time, and as we've all seen, and as Jamie summed up, the speed at which the investment community is moving with respect to their awareness of the importance of E&S in particular is pretty breathtaking. And certainly the societal awareness of these sorts of issues now is louder and clearer than we've ever seen before. I suppose the challenge for us now is to try to beat our industry into shape so that we can catch up with everybody else. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, and we're all volunteers here trying to change these codes. So I think it's a big challenge. It's a very noble challenge, and I think the only way that we can really meet that challenge is by collaboration, and that's why it's so good to have this. To bring everyone together like this, and I'm sure together we can step up and see what we can achieve here.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, John. So on that note, if I can invite everybody who is still on our panel, maybe if you want to turn on your videos just so we can all wave goodbye. But final comments from myself. By getting ESG right, or at least by acknowledging all of these different, very complicated aspects of environment, social and governance, not only can we try and reduce the threat to projects, but also the communities and the environment round about us, but also begin to identify and realize some of those fantastic opportunities that are on the table through this. So I'm really excited by a lot of what we've heard today. Is the journey ahead of us long? Yes, but hopefully I think with all of the momentum that we've got with us and all of those different stakeholders as well pointing in the same direction, be it investors, regulators, etc., hopefully we can really make a step change difference with regards to where we're going. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation today. The recordings will be available. The answers and the questions will also be available. Please get in touch with other ideas for how we can take this forward as well. It is now 16:30 on the dot GMT. Check that out. The timing. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause to all of you. Well done. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, morning, wherever you might be, and let's keep the debate and the conversation going forward and have some real action. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.